Whenever a new item releases in Guts and Blackpowder, it'll always fall into the discussion of whether it's good or bad. Usually, people will have mixed feelings on these items. Some people saying that it's good, some saying that it's okay, and you'll definitely be getting people saying that it's really bad. This is especially true for the new items added for the Priest in the Roscoff update, namely the Divinity, a replaceable for the Blessing, and Exorcism, a replaceable for the base Crucifix. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what these items do, how they compare to the original, if they're good or not, and what changes they should have, if any. Starting with Divinity, this is an item that can be bought for 900 francs, and it replaces your Blessing. It works similarly to Blessing in that you have to interact with other players in order to use it. When used, Divinity will reduce 25% of the infection that a player has, and it will grant a status effect that will make them immune to infection increase for 65 seconds. The item has 3 uses before it empties, in which it will have a 25-second cooldown before it can be recharged. After the cooldown, it can be recharged by getting kill assists. Whenever you attack a zombie and that zombie dies, it adds +1 to the meter. You have to attack 3 different zombies to fully regain Divinity. While the item is in its recharge state, you cannot bless a player even if your meter is somewhat filled. It has to be completely full in order to use it again. This blessing alternative can be used on any player that isn't fully infected, even on those that have no infection at all. This differs from the original blessing as that item can only bless a player when their infection is between 15% to 100% exclusive. Divinity also comes with the Mercy ability that's seen with the original blessing, in which you can use on fully infected soldiers to prevent them from becoming viral runners or sapper zombies. Additional information worth mentioning is that Divinity does not refill the crucifix meter when used. However, it can refill Exorcism by 13%. Divinity is pretty much used in the same ways as Blessing, but the advantages between the two are pretty noticeable. Divinity only has a 25% infection cure compared to the Blessing's 80% over its lifetime. However, Blessing does not have a special immunity buff like Divinity, so the uses can differ in some ways. Typically, Divinity is going to be more useful for players that have little infection, while Blessing is going to be a lot better for players that have considerable amounts of infection. One thing to point out is that while Divinity only cures 25%, infection decay paired with immunity does allow players to regain their sanity safely. However, this does not apply to hardcore mode as infection decay does not exist. Availability is a key factor in the differences between these two items. Blessing has a passive 40-second recharge after full use, while Divinity has a 25-second cooldown before it can be recharged, but the recharged condition is very easy. You simply have to hit 3 different zombies. In this sense, Divinity can be charged between 25 to 30 seconds if there are zombies present, which is about 10 to 15 seconds faster than Blessing, which is pretty nice. However, you do have to consider that zombies have to be nearby in order to recharge it. There are sections of objective modes where zombies stop spawning, or in endless mode when your team decides to stall. In these situations, Divinity can actually take much longer than Blessing to recharge. So when it comes to how available Divinity can be, it would really depend on the circumstance. Whereas Blessing is just a passive 40-second recharge cooldown, so it's more consistent. Another thing to point out is that Blessing recharges the crucifix meter by 35%, as opposed to Divinity not charging it at all. Both blessings recharge Exorcism by the same value, which is 13%. When comparing the pros and cons between the Blessing and Divinity, is the newer item really that bad? Well, I'd say it's actually quite viable. As said before on normal mode, while Divinity only cures 25%, the infection decay is a mechanic that can pretty much do the rest of the work for a player. When you pair this advantage to the fact that it can also be recharged faster, then in some sense Blessing does fall off a bit as you don't need the full 80% cure. However, this is completely different on hardcore mode in which infection decay does not exist. With Divinity, you may have to bless a person multiple times in order for them to be fully cured, and this can be problematic sometimes, as once you give someone Divinity, they'll have immunity for 65 seconds, and you'll have to wait that duration before you can bless them again. To put it simply, Divinity is going to be a bit stronger in normal mode, whereas Blessing is going to find a bit more use in hardcore. However, I do think that Divinity is overall weaker than Blessing due to two main reasons. For one, the availability of the item can be very inconsistent. It's either going to take very little time to get the recharge, or it's going to take a very long time depending on the circumstance. And two, Divinity cannot increase the meter for the base crucifix. When it comes to what changes that should be made for Divinity, I think it would be nice to reduce the cooldown from 25 seconds to 20 seconds, or have some other buff that allows Divinity to recharge consistently faster than Blessing. I don't think buffing availability is necessary. However, a more important change that should be made is allowing Divinity to recharge the base crucifix. In the current game, there's pretty much no reason to pair Crucifix with Divinity when Blessing gives a 35% recharge to the meter, which is quite a lot. I think Divinity should recharge 20% of the Crucifix's meter. While that's twice less than Blessing, the item could be used more often, so it would be fair. I think this kind of change would give players more incentive to choose Divinity over the default Blessing whenever they use the base Crucifix. Overall, Divinity is a pretty good side grade, although it needs a buff to their Crucifix recharge. If you do happen to equip this item, do make sure you use it on players who fight aggressively on the front lines, while also blessing players who really need it. Now moving on to the Exorcism Crucifix, an item that people have stronger feelings against, and honestly for pretty good reason. Exorcism can be bought from the shop for 1200 francs, and it can replace the base Crucifix. This cross debuffs zombies similar to the default, however instead of stunning zombies and pushing them away, it slows them down and deals tick damage. The damage can range from around 19 to 27 damage per second depending on how close the zombies are to the player. It also stops shamblers from grabbing teammates. The range is a 20 by 20 by 30 stud radius, which is supposedly the same as the base Crucifix. Of course, none of these effects work on bombers, because why would they? Exorcism works on a meter similar to the base Crucifix. However, at the start of every match, this meter will be empty. In order to fill up the meter, you will have to actively participate, either by attacking with the stake, blessing players, or using mercy. Every hit with the stake will fill the meter by 4%, and the increase is purely hit based. Other factors like damage, headshots, or kills do not matter. This means it requires 25 hits to completely fill the meter. It's worth noting that hitting zombies that are spawning in will not add charge. Blessings, either from the default or Divinity, will fill up the meter by 13% per use. And of course, Mercy will fill up the meter completely with just one use. Exorcism can only be activated when the meter is completely full, and when used to the full extent, it can last a total of 10 seconds, despite some sources saying 8. If Exorcism completely empties out from a full use, then it will undergo a 40-second cooldown to which it cannot be recharged. Exorcism can be cancelled during activation by unequipping. Doing so will immediately drain the meter by an additional 4%. If Exorcism is cancelled this way, then you don't have to wait a full 40 seconds in order to recharge it again. You'd only have to wait about 5 seconds. With the traits of Exorcism covered, let's talk about how this item compares to the base Crucifix, which we all know is quite powerful for several reasons. For one, the Crucifix is really good for saving teammates that are in a desperate grab situation, due to its massive range and effective stunning. It can also be really good for crowd control, but this largely depends on the player. Someone who misuses the Crucifix will use it at the wrong time and will push zombies away from attack range, causing them to bunch up and become even more harmful to the team. A competent priest will use the Crucifix to help teammates attack more safely and take out hordes quicker. The Crucifix can be activated anytime it's not in its cooldown state, which allows for more strategic use. And while it does have a hefty 50-second cooldown, this can be alleviated by the Blessing, which grants 35% recharge. Now, does Exorcism achieve some of the great things that Crucifix does? To put it bluntly, no. The effects of Exorcism are just way too weak. While Exorcism can stop shamblers from grabbing teammates, they can still move around and attack. Which means that even if you save a teammate from a shambler grab, they're still vulnerable to damage. What's more is that there could be a sapper zombie or a runner nearby, which can put them in even more trouble. Exorcism also can't even save teammates from runners, which is one of the things that makes the Crucifix so useful. In terms of crowd control, Exorcism can be pretty decent. As said before, it deals somewhere around 19 to 27 damage per second depending on how close the zombies are to the player. With the full use, it can deal a total damage of 186 to 268 damage, which is quite a lot and can certainly take out zombies in high waves of endless and late objective. Although in all fairness, damage isn't really meant to take out hordes by itself. It's meant to weaken zombies so that your teammates have an easier time killing them. When crowd controlling with either crucifix, you're probably going to use these items when a large group of targets is in front of you. It's very common though that additional zombies will walk into the range of these effects. In these situations, a longer lasting ability is going to be more useful. The crucifix is going to be better as it can last 15 seconds as opposed to the Exorcism's 10. What's more is that the crucifix can actually last longer than 15 seconds. Even when the meter runs out, if you continue to hold out the item in front of the crowd you're affecting, then they'll remain stunned for a while. The crucifix can also help sappers rebuild their structures, since it lasts so long and can stop zombies from attacking those buildings. Exorcism can't do the same since it only slows them down. This also means that Exorcism can't really save your team when the players' backs are against the wall, whereas the crucifix can. What makes Exorcism even worse is the inconsistent availability of the item. As talked before about Divinity, in objective mode there can be certain sections where zombies stop spawning. In those situations, the Exorcism crucifix cannot be recharged, whereas the crucifix, if it was fully used, can be passively recharging and be available for the next time it's needed. It also doesn't help that Exorcism can only be activated under the condition that the meter is full, whereas crucifix can be activated anytime it's not in its recharge cooldown state. There's also a 40-second cooldown when fully using Exorcism. However, any competent priest knows that they should always avoid this cooldown. There's just no situation where fully using the meter is worth it. With this in mind, Exorcism can actually be used more often than Crucifix in Endless mode, especially on high waves when there are more opportunities to attack large groups of zombies. However, even on higher waves of Endless, particularly somewhere from wave 25 to wave 30, the damage of Exorcism can start to become pretty worthless, so there wouldn't be much point in using it anyways. On the other hand, Crucifix doesn't lose much value on higher waves. In fact, it can be even more useful on much tougher groups as long as it's used wisely. So to shortly summarize why Exorcism is so much weaker than Crucifix, the effects are just really weak in comparison, it's not as consistently available, and there's just no general situation where Exorcism will be more useful than Crucifix. Another thing worth noting is that Exorcism does not slow down zombies in hardcore, which effectively makes the item worthless in that game mode. I can only think of one specific situation where Exorcism is always better than Crucifix, and that would be the finale of Copenhagen. In that finale, Exorcism can deal damage to zombies who are following and climbing the boat, instead of pushing them off and gathering a larger group, while it's impossible for your team to attack them. However, Crucifix is still going to be much more useful in every other section of the map. The only other good thing I'd say about Exorcism is that it can be pretty satisfying to use on a crowd when you have hit sound on. Now if you do plan on using Exorcism, there's only really two things you have to keep in mind. One, you're only really going to use this item to deal with a large crowd of zombies, and two, you should never fully use the meter, because the 40-second cooldown is never worth it. Exorcism is one of those items in the game that is truly unviable, in that if you use Exorcism over Crucifix, you're kind of throwing as a priest. There's nothing wrong with the concept of Exorcism, or the playstyle it encourages. The main problem is its implementation in the current game, which makes it so weak. You can be a priest using Crucifix and be aggressive, and you'd be much more useful than an aggressive priest using Exorcism. In order for Exorcism to be viable, it would have to have massive buffs. There's multiple ways it could be changed, and personally I don't really care how it's done, just as long as the item actually becomes good compared to Crucifix. There are two main changes that I think should be made with Exorcism, however. One, removing the cooldown completely, and two, granting the slowness debuff in hardcore. The cooldown is honestly pretty unnecessary, and it's pointless if people are just going to cancel the item at the very last second. I don't think I have to elaborate much on adding the slowness debuff in hardcore. Not too sure why that item wouldn't slow down zombies in that game mode, if it was an intentional decision. Another buff I could see fitting with Exorcism is allowing activation whenever the meter is somewhat filled, instead of only when it's completely full. Upon cancellation or a full use, there would be a 5-second cooldown before you could both reactivate or recharge the exorcism. This kind of change would allow players to use exorcism more frequently and flexibly than even crucifix, which I think is fitting because this item is meant to encourage aggression. Boosting either the range, damage, or slowness effect of exorcism are very basic ways to buff the item, but I think exorcism deserves one of these. Another interesting change I've heard for the exorcism is making the damage percentage based on the zombie's total health rather than making it flat damage. For example, it would deal somewhere between 50% to 80% of a zombie's total health over full use. This essentially means that regardless of how tough the zombies are, exorcism would perform the same as it would on weaker zombies, which I think is a pretty nice idea. You could keep a little bit of flat damage so that it could take out weaker zombies of early objective or endless by itself. And with all that, I'm finally done yapping. I talked way too much about these items, especially since exorcism is likely to be changed pretty soon. You guys should comment what you think about these items. Are they good or bad? And what kind of changes do you think should be made with them?